The night was perfect. Soft golden lights shimmered from the chandeliers. The scent of gourmet dishes filled the air, and the gentle hum of conversations added to the elegance of the upscale restaurant. Among the well-dressed guests, three wealthy women sat at a beautifully set table, laughing over their drinks. Dressed in designer outfits, adorned with sparkling jewelry, they radiated confidence and luxury. They were used to the finest things in life, and tonight was no exception. As their conversation grew livelier, a young waitress approached their table, her hands carefully balancing a tray. She wore the standard black and white uniform, her hair neatly tied back. But her posture was hesitant, and her expression carried a quiet nervousness. The moment she reached the table, one of the women, a blonde with an air of superiority, barely looked up before making a dismissive remark. Finally, she sighed, glancing at her friends with a smirk. "I swear, this place will hire just anyone these days." The others chuckled, their laughter low but sharp enough to sting. The waitress stiffened for a moment, but said nothing. She had heard comments like this before. She had learned to stay quiet, to keep her head down. But tonight, something about their tone, their arrogance, made it harder to ignore. As she placed the drinks on the table, another woman raised an eyebrow. "Are you new here?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "You seem out of place." The waitress simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she said politely, avoiding eye contact. The women exchanged amused glances. To them, she was just another forgettable face, someone who existed only to serve. They continued their conversation, barely acknowledging her presence. But what they didn't know was that their words, their laughter, their judgmental stares were all being noticed. And soon they would learn a truth that would leave them absolutely speechless. Because the woman they had just insulted wasn't just any waitress. She was someone they never expected. And when they finally realized who she was, it would be too late to take their words back. The waitress took a slow breath, steadying herself as she turned away from the table. She had dealt with rude customers before, but something about this group unsettled her. Maybe it was the way they laughed so easily at her expense, or how they spoke like they owned the world. Either way, she wasn't going to let them ruin her night. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she could hear their voices trailing behind her. "Did you see how nervous she was?" one of them whispered, barely trying to hide it. "Honestly, I don't know why restaurants like this don't hire more polished staff." Another woman chuckled. "Well, not everyone is lucky enough to be born into the right life." The words stung, but she didn't react. Instead, she stepped into the back of the restaurant, her expression unreadable. A few of the other staff members noticed her tense posture, but no one said anything. They all knew that dealing with customers like that was just part of the job. What the women didn't realize, though, was that this waitress had a past they couldn't begin to imagine. She wasn't just working here for a paycheck. She wasn't just another employee trying to make ends meet. This place, it meant something deeper to her. A waiter passing by leaned in. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She forced a small smile. "Yeah," she replied, "just the usual." But it wasn't just the usual. Not tonight. Back at the table, the women continued their conversation, completely unaware of how wrong they were about her. To them, she was invisible, someone beneath their notice. They had no idea that the restaurant they were sitting in, the luxurious decor, the perfectly crafted menu, all of it was connected to her in a way they would never have guessed. And soon, whether they were ready for it or not, they were going to find out exactly who she was. And when they did, their laughter would come to a sudden, stunned silence. The evening carried on, and the women at the table remained lost in their own world, sipping expensive wine and exchanging stories of lavish vacations and designer shopping sprees. The waitress, however, continued working, her expression calm but her mind elsewhere. She had spent years preparing for this moment, yet she never expected it to unfold like this. As she moved between tables, she overheard pieces of their conversation. One of them, the blonde who had been the most condescending, was bragging about a recent business deal. Honestly, running a company is exhausting, she sighed dramatically, twirling her glass. I don't know how people manage it without connections. Another woman laughed. Well, not everyone is born into the right family, she teased. Some people actually have to work their way up. They laughed again, completely unaware of how close their words hit to the truth. In the background, the restaurant manager had been watching. He knew who the waitress really was, and he also knew she had chosen to keep her identity hidden, for now. Approaching her quietly, he murmured, "Do you want me to step in?" She shook her head. Not yet. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the head chef was giving final touches to the evening signature dish. He was an older man with years of experience, and like the manager, he knew exactly who the waitress was. They have no idea, do they? He muttered to himself as he plated an elegant entree. As the women continued their meal, one of them finally took a closer look at the waitress. She seems oddly familiar, she mused, tilting her head. I can't quite place it, but I feel like I've seen her before. The others waved it off, too preoccupied with themselves to think much of it. But the seed of curiosity had been planted, and soon, whether they liked it or not, they would come face to face with the truth. Because when the time came for the owner of the restaurant to make an appearance, the last person they expected to see was the very woman they had just disrespected. The laughter at the table had begun to fade as the women settled into their meals, but the air of superiority still lingered. The waitress moved carefully around them, her expression unreadable, though inside she felt a storm brewing. She had spent years working in silence, building something greater than anyone had imagined. And now she was moments away from revealing it. As she returned with a fresh bottle of wine, the blonde woman barely looked up. Finally, she muttered, holding out her empty glass, "Try not to spill this time." The waitress remained calm, pouring the wine with steady hands. But as she did, something shifted in the room. The restaurant manager had stepped forward, speaking in hushed tones with a few staff members. The head chef adjusted his apron, stealing a glance toward the dining area. Even the bartenders at the far end of the room paused slightly, their eyes flickering toward her. The tension was almost electric. Then the moment came. The restaurant doors swung open, and a tall, sharply dressed man entered. His presence commanded attention, and whispers spread through the room. The staff immediately straightened, and a few guests turned to look, sensing something important was happening. At the table, the women barely noticed until the man approached them directly. He gave a small nod to the waitress before turning to the group with a polite but firm expression. "Ladies," he said smoothly, "I trust you're enjoying your evening." The blonde woman glanced up with a forced smile. "It's been fine," she said, then frowned slightly. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "I'm the general manager, and I wanted to personally introduce you to someone." He then took a step back, and suddenly every eye in the room was on the waitress. The women blinked in confusion as the staff stood straighter, their expressions shifting from quiet acknowledgement to subtle admiration. And in that moment, realization began to dawn. The woman they had just dismissed as a mere waitress wasn't just an employee here. She was the one who had built this restaurant. And in mere seconds, they were about to learn the truth. The room felt different now. The air was heavier, the silence stretching just a second too long. The three women exchanged confused glances, their smiles faltering. The general manager's words echoed in their minds, but they didn't quite make sense yet. The blonde woman let out a short, nervous laugh. "Wait, what?" she scoffed, looking between the manager and the waitress. "What do you mean, introduce us?" The waitress, who had remained quiet until now, finally lifted her head. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, just a quiet confidence that made the women shift uncomfortably in their seats. She slowly removed her apron, folding it neatly over her arm, before taking a step closer. "I suppose I should introduce myself properly," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not just a waitress here." She paused for a moment, watching their reactions. "I own this restaurant." The words hit like a shockwave. The women blinked, their polished facades cracking as realization sank in. The same person they had dismissed, insulted, and laughed at was the one responsible for everything around them. The chandeliers, the exquisite menu, the very table they were dining at, it all belonged to her. The brunette woman at the table cleared her throat, trying to recover. "You're joking," she said, forcing a smile. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding." The general manager stepped forward, shaking his head. "No misunderstanding," he said firmly. "This restaurant exists because of her. She built it from the ground up." For the first time that evening, the women were speechless. But just as the weight of the truth began settling in, another voice interrupted. "I was wondering when I'd see you again." The waitress stiffened. The voice came from a table near the back, where a man in an expensive suit had been watching the entire exchange. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at his lips. The blonde woman's face paled. She knew him. And suddenly, the tension in the room wasn't just about the waitress anymore. Something else was at play, something bigger, deeper. And whatever it wasn't over yet. "Sure, I'll write the next part of your story with an intense climax, resolving the conflicts while adding a surprising twist at the end. Here it is." A deep silence settled over the house as Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow. The truth had unraveled like a frayed thread, leading her straight to the person she had least expected. The hidden letters, the strange calls in the night, the missing photographs, it all pointed to one thing. Across the dimly lit room, her older brother, Daniel, watched her with an unreadable expression. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said quietly, stepping forward. His voice held no malice, just a tired resignation. Emily shook her head, her heart pounding. "It was you all along." The realization sent a shiver down her spine. "Everything? Why?" Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You were never supposed to come back here, Em. I tried to warn you. I thought if I scared you off, you'd leave before." He trailed off, looking away. "Before what?" she pressed, stepping closer. Before he could answer, a loud creak echoed from the hallway. Both of them turned sharply. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching unnaturally across the floor. Then came a whisper, low, almost inaudible, but undeniably real. Emily felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just the two of them. Someone else was here. Daniel's face darkened. "It's not safe," he muttered. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the lights flickered violently, and a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them. Emily's pulse raced. The room felt colder, the air thick with something unseen yet unmistakably present. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. Tall, unmoving, its face hidden in the dim light. A chill ran down her spine as it took a slow step forward. Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Don't look at it," he whispered urgently. "Just move." But Emily couldn't. She knew this house held secrets, but she never expected this. Her gaze locked on the figure, her breath coming in short gasps. And then, in a voice she hadn't heard in years, it spoke. Emily. Her blood ran cold. The voice belonged to someone who was supposed to be gone. Someone who had disappeared without a trace. Their mother. Daniel's grip on her wrist tightened, but she barely noticed. The figure took another step, and this time the light hit its face. Emily staggered back, her heart hammering. It was her mother, but not as she remembered. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes held a sorrow too deep for words. You were never supposed to come back, the voice whispered again. Tears stung Emily's eyes. Mom. But before she could reach out, the figure began to fade, dissolving like mist in the moonlight. The temperature in the room shifted, the oppressive weight lifting, as if the house itself had exhaled. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stilled. The door creaked open, the shadows retreating into their corners. Daniel let out a shaky breath. It's over, he murmured. Emily wasn't so sure. She turned to him, searching his face for answers. What did she mean? Daniel hesitated. She wasn't warning you. His voice was barely above a whisper. She was warning them. A beat of silence. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, a floorboard creaked. Not from something leaving. From something waking up. Emily and Daniel stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats. The house was silent again, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. Emily swallowed hard. We need to leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded, but something in his eyes told her he knew more than he had admitted. He glanced toward the hallway, where the creaking had come from, and then back at her. Come on, he said, grabbing her hand. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the old wooden floor. Emily could feel the house watching them, its walls, its corners, its very foundation holding onto something it wasn't ready to let go of. As they reached the front door, Emily hesitated. She turned back, her heart pulling at something she didn't fully understand. She was trying to protect us, wasn't she? She asked. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders heavy. Yeah, he admitted. I think she was. For years, their mother's disappearance had been a mystery, a wound that never quite healed. Now Emily knew the truth. She had never left. Not in the way they had thought. The house had kept her, just like it had kept its secrets, whispering them through the walls, waiting for someone to listen. Emily stepped outside, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the air in her lungs as something real, something free. The night was quiet, the stars above steady and unmoving, as if the world had been waiting for this moment to finally let go. Daniel shut the door behind them, locking whatever remained inside. He turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. We don't come back, he said. She nodded. We don't. As they walked away, neither of them looked back. But Emily knew, deep in her bones, that the house would always be there. Waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, letting go of its ghosts too.